Hello, everybody. My name is Jimmy Smith of the Wine with Jimmy channel. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is the sparkling wine section, and this is actually part 2 of the sparkling wine sessions for the WSET Level 3 certificate. The first part was an introduction to sparkling wine, including vineyard and winery considerations and key style labels. This part is actually going into one of the major methods that we mentioned in that first part, and that is the all-important traditional method, or the method champenoise, as it may be known, and also the method traditionnelle. So this is that very classic method, which is a two-fermentation approach that creates some of our most famous sparkling wines in the world. As ever, if you have any comments, questions at all, please do get in touch with us. You can leave a comment in the comments section below this video on YouTube, or you can get in touch with us with any of that social media, which is at the bottom of every slide. At Wine with Jimmy is my own social media across things like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. The 2 wine schools are there, and also my wine bar as well. And as ever, we will have a working written question at the end of this session. We actually didn't have one on the first one because it was an introduction, but we will go through a working written question. That's one of the theoretical written questions, really where students have to focus on the most. And because this is sparkling wines, please remember you will be tested in the written capacity on sparkling and fortified wines. One of your 25 mark questions will be on sparkling and fortified. So it's very, very important that you understand these sections. So let's go through the traditional method. There's just a lovely bottle, which is actually under cork and staple, as you can see on the left-hand side here, but it has that sediment at the bottom of it, and we'll come to that a little bit later. So we're going to start from the beginning. We've mentioned about vineyard and winery considerations on the previous section. On this one, we're going to be starting to talk about the actual fermentation. So this one is, in fact, making the base wine, or what we may also call the first fermentation. So I might pop that up there actually, just so you're okay and you're aware of that, as it may be mentioned. That's first fermentation. There you go. Okay, so traditional method, making the base wine or the first fermentation. So those grapes we mentioned on the last one must come in with sufficient ripeness, but very high acidities. They shouldn't be underripe. And they will be relatively low in sugar and therefore potential alcohol. The wine will be fermented, so it will be fermented more often, as you'll see in this picture, in large stainless steel vats of varying sizes, depending on, of course, the source of the fruit and how much volume they are producing. So this really is important. The stainless steel production here means you have reductive winemaking techniques, that's non-oxidative, which means we therefore can keep the wines as fresh as possible. Quite neutral and fresh is what they're aiming for as a base wine for traditional method sparkling wines. So the big majority are done in inert stainless steel vessels. However, you may find that oak can be used for this first fermentation. This would be a stylistic choice of the winery. So here is the courtyard in front of Krug. There's a load of barrels because Krug quite famously use a proportion of oak for their based wine. This will increase texture, roundness, and a bit more body into that base wine. And that's if you're aiming to produce that kind of sparkling wine later down the line. Bollinger is another famous one, and many very small growers will actually opt for this process as well. So oak may be used in that instance. But normally the resulting wine, and this is really focusing on the stainless steel approach, will be dry. It will be relatively neutral. Normally it's somewhere around sort of 11%-ish ABV, and will have very high acidity levels, which is very, very important. The acidity is mightily important, as we've mentioned on the first session, really to maintain freshness, but then also to make sure that the sparkling wine will be able to go through its latter stages of aging, such as yeast autolysis, and will be able to counter all of the flavors, aromas, and texture which are created by that yeast autolysis. The acidity is very important as that counterpoint and balancing factor. Some wines, certainly if oak is used, may undergo malolactic or small proportions of malolactic, and of course will be in oak, and that may create that kind of textural, richer characteristic. So that's actually for the oak-based side of things, but most will not go through that process. Okay, so we at that point have a first fermented still wine at that point. Now, some of this wine will actually be stored as reserve wine and will be put aside. In fact, in somewhere like Champagne, there are laws around the percentage of of reserve wine that you must put aside. So this reserve wine, or what's called vin de réserve in France, is important because it's mightily significant that this wine is put aside because of possible vintage variation and poor vintages in the future. And it means that champagne houses or sparkling wine producers can then draw on that reserve wine for later wines. And it therefore means you'll create a consistency across your wine. I've actually put a picture of Charles Heidsieck, their Brut Reserve here. This is a labeling term, reserve, so ignore that for now. But Charles Heidsieck are quite famous for the amount of vin de réserve that they have in their blend. It's often near 50%. That near 50% of reserve wine means, of course, that's older wine that's been stored, and it's being stored in the wineries for years and years, and will go back in some instances 5, 10, 15, 20 years. With Charles Heidsieck, it's quite long. It's often around 10 years. And even a little bit longer. And with things like Krug, it goes back probably about 20 years. And this is really to create more complexities, but also to iron out any issues that you may have with future years. So vin de réserve. Now, if you are a consumer and you love your bubbles, a real good question to ask a winemaker is the percentage of vin de réserve wine in the blend, because this will give you an indication of the wine's general complexity. If it's a smaller number, something like 25, 30%, there'll be often less complexities, whereas if it's a bigger number, you'll expect more. But there are further questions to ask, but it's a bit above our pay grade for this WSET Level 3 certificate. Okay, so that leads us into blending, because we've just been talking about vin de réserve. Often the grapes that come into the winery and the different type of grape varieties, for example, Chardonnay, Meunier, and Pinot Noir, will be fermented in separate parcels depending on where they come from, and of course, as separate grape varieties. So it may be that you have a Chardonnay part of your winery, a Meunier part, and a Pinot Noir part, and they are further broken down into their location of village and vineyard. And that means, of course, you have to therefore have, like the picture earlier, many, many stainless steel vats to deal with this as the grapes are coming into the winery. So grapes will be fermented in those small parcels and small selections. Now, they then will draw upon all of these stainless steel vats. So they will, of course, analyze them and get all the data they need from that, but also then the sensory data by tasting and assessing these wines. So why do we then blend? So let's talk through these. We kind of mentioned one of these already, which is the third one, but we'll go through it again. Blending is important for, first of all, making a house style. So one of the major productions of traditional method sparkling wines certainly are what we call the non-vintage sparkling wines, which is normally the signature wine of a winery, certainly in Champagne, for instance. A non-vintage means it is blended between a number of vintages. So you are drawing upon different years to obviously sort of iron out any issues of climate, but also to create a balance. So that is kind of the house style, as we would call it. And that's what's really what they follow a recipe for as much as they can, with some differences per year, to try and get that consistent style. So somebody who tastes a Veuve Clicquot 10 years ago should really still be able to taste a similarity today, for instance. It should have that classic house stamp style to it. As we've already mentioned as well, achieving a balance as well. So this is more talking about the breadth of varieties that one can draw upon. So for example, in Champagne, the 3 classic grape varieties that make about 99% of the production. So that is Chardonnay, Meunier, and Pinot Noir. Chardonnay is said to add the characteristics like citrus fruit. It gives finesse and elegance, and also longevity for aging. Whereas Pinot Noir, on the other hand, tends to have a roundness, richness, softness, and often gives red fruits. So combining those two will obtain a balance, a medium point, which will give a wonderful sort of harmony to the sparkling wine. And then adding complexity. So being able to draw upon what we just mentioned on the last slide, the reserve wine. That's wine that's been stored from previous years. That will have aged, it will have oxidized, even if it's in stainless steel, and this will be more complex. Drawing upon that more complex wine will then add in much more complexity. Things like more richness, more dried fruits, more tertiary compounds to the fresh notes that have just been made from what you've brought in from that current year. Some will only blend a few vintages, maybe only really from the last few years. Some will blend 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years, depending on the quality of the estate, of course. You may see it written as assemblage blending, which is on that label in the middle, rather on the bottle in the middle, which is the French for blending. So at that point, remember, we still have a still wine. So it needs to go through its secondary fermentation. There is a picture of a monk here. This is not Dom Perignon. This is Brother Jean Audard. You do not need to know this, but he's the very important monk who really fine-tuned the secondary fermentation method. And this second fermentation is the all-important stage for really creating the quality and consistency of sparkling wine. Before this process, it was all done via one fermentation, what's called the ancestral method, which was much harder to actually govern due to the climatic differences during winter when the fermentation will happen. So what happens? You have your still wine. That still wine is placed into a bottle. And before we close that bottle, we add into it what's called the liqueur de tirage. The liqueur de tirage, so let's just underline that there. You will need to know this terminology. Liqueur de tirage is a mixture of wine, sugar, very important, yeast nutrients, and clarifying agent. The clarifying agent will help it later when it riddles. The yeast nutrients feeds the yeast. The yeast will eat the sugar, and there's a bit of wine in there for good measure as well. So this addition of liqueur de tirage, basically, this is a creation environment, again, for another fermentation. You will not need to know about the numbers of how much liqueur de tirage is added, so do not worry about that for the level 3 certificate. Then the bottle, once these liqueur de tirage has been added, the bottle will be sealed normally with a crown cap or a beer cap that we're most used to. Some will be used with a cork and staple, but it's a very small percentage. So normally a crown cap. That will then close the environment with that liqueur de tirage inside with the wine. It will then undergo its secondary fermentation. This will happen in the cool, damp cellars that you will find in places like Champagne, stacked horizontally to give it more surface area. So then there is much more contact with the yeast at a later stage. The second fermentation that begins, so that yeast you've added will feed on that sugar, and it creates a little bit more alcohol, around 1.2 to 1.3% ABV will be produced at this point. So that bumps it up to normally 12 to 12.5% alcohol by volume in total. Of course, what's given off with a fermentation is the gas called carbon dioxide, CO2. This will then be dissolved and saturated into the wine, and that forms a pressure inside that bottle, often around 5 to 6 atmospheres. Good numbers for you to know. And then the third thing it really creates after it is complete is that the yeast has nothing to feed upon, and the environment becomes a little bit too toxic for it. So it cannot exist, so it dies and then forms what's called the lees, sediment or lees. So your dead yeast cells. Okay, so that second fermentation gives you a guaranteed predictable amount of sparkle, that's the carbon dioxide, gives you a little bit more alcohol, and then the dead yeast cells for the next stage in the process. And the next stage in the process is what we call yeast autolysis. So this has been mentioned before. You will have talked about this in white wine making with things like Burgundies and so on, white wines that often will go through this process. It is a reaction between the dead yeast and the wine. Okay, so what basically happens is that the yeast will break down as it dies, and then a reaction will happen between the dead yeast and the wine, and chemical compounds are given out. And this creates a bit more texture, but also gives you the aromas and flavors over a long period of time, which are things like biscuit, bread, brioche, and toast. This will usually last something like 4 to 5 years. It can be lower than that, but it's quite normal to be about 4 to 5 years. And in some instances beyond that, 10 years, 12 years with the very top end sparkling wines of the world. The autolytic notes I mentioned, please reference your systematic approach to tasting card. Look under the secondary characteristics, and you'll see there is a classification for autolytic, and that's the yeasty characters: bread, biscuit, brioche, and toast, which will be added. It will be quite significant for most sparkling wines if they have years of this, because it is a small environment in a bottle with quite a lot of surface area of yeast, so that will give a fair bit of character to it. We now need to get rid of that sediment in the bottle to create a crystal clear product. And this will be obtained, this method, by riddling and then disgorging. So first of all, riddling, or the French call this, and you may see it written, remouage. Okay, let's pop that down, remouage. So you may see it written as that. Basically, this is moving the bottle from a horizontal position to a more inverted vertical position. And that gets the yeast slowly from the kind of side of the bottle down to the neck of the bottle. That is the aim here. Traditionally, this will be done by hand, by skilled, trained remueurs or riddlers in these A-frame easel boards, which are called pupitres. These pupitres, the bottle will start horizontal, and after a number of months, a number of weeks, it will actually end up more vertical. They also will be spun in certain directions to help that yeast move down to the neck of the bottle. Okay, that is the traditional way of doing it in pupitre by hand. It is more labor intensive, slow, takes about 6 to 8 weeks, and it's done today for more prestige cuvée champagnes, and then more kind of specific smaller grower champagnes. But of course, with modernization, we have something called the Gyropalette, which has been used. This was actually created first in Catalonia for cava production, but is now widely adopted for traditional method sparkling wines of the world. These are large boxes, which hold metal boxes, which hold around 500 bottles, and will complete the riddling process, which would normally take nearly 2 months, in just a few days. There are traveling Gyropalette companies which will go around all the houses and actually do it for them and get that yeast to the neck of the bottle. Okay, so we have the yeast at the neck of the bottle, and it will look something like this picture on the left-hand side. They're frosted bottles, so ignore that for now, but you'll see that the yeast is sitting on the neck of the bottle, actually sitting on the crown cap. Okay, so the bottle this time is upside down. Now, all of these bottles will then be placed upside down with just a neck going into an icy bath of brine solution, which is very cold. It's still liquid, but it is well below 0 degrees C. This will then, of course, freeze the sediment. So it freezes the wine and the yeast in the neck only, because that's the only bit you're dipping into it. So that encapsulates that yeast in that wine frozen on the neck of the bottle. The bottle then is inverted to the correct way, and the crown cap is removed, normally by machine, but it can be done by hand. This will therefore mean that the frozen wine and yeast, which has been encapsulated, is absolutely pushed out by the pressure, which, remember, is around 5 to 6 atmospheres within that bottle. It comes shooting out all as one solid, and that means that the leftover in that bottle, which is the sparkling wine, is therefore going to be clear at that point. Then, straight after that, the Liqueur d'Expédition is added. And this is we'll go into the next slide actually, but this is the very important stage that determines the sweetness of the sparkling wine. So the bottle will then be sealed with cork, wire, and foil. And the cork, which is put in, will sit under the lip of the champagne or sparkling bottle. It starts off looking a little bit like a skirt, but it gets a little, as it matures, it actually gets less kind of angular. And it will have a wire cage around it and foil on top of it as well. The French call this habillage, and I can scribble that down here as well if you wish. Habillage. And that is basically the dressing of the sparkling wine bottle. So what is the Liqueur d'Expédition? When that's added into the bottle just before the cork goes on, this is what we call the dosage. But the actual terminology for what's added is called Liqueur d'Expédition. This is a mixture of wine and sugar, and it will determine the final sweetness level. If you refer back to part 1, the video before this on sparkling wine, there is a slide on those differing sweetness levels from things like zero dosage through extra brut, brut, and things like sec, extra sec, demi-sec, and doux is the amount of sugar that is being added. This will balance the acidity because, of course, it's a bit of quite rich sugar that's going on. That's one of the main traditional reasons, historical reasons why this is done, because the acidity of these cold climate products are exceptionally high and austere. So that bit of sugar will balance that out and make it more ready to market. But it also will aid flavor development. And that's important because the actual wine that goes in, and I'll underline that up here because that's what we mentioned earlier, this mixture of wine and sugar, what the wine actually is and how complex it is will actually create more flavor profiles. So that's another way that actually blending in something here can add to complexity. You may want to use something very fresh if you want without that complexity. So that decision is quite important. And that's what's said there at the bottom. The character of the dosage, that's what is the wine, is very important. So we've just gone through that, of course. And then there may be, once that's all been sealed with a cork and the mesh and the foil, the bottle is then secure. It may go through a bit of bottle aging, maybe just a few months, so the Liqueur d'Expédition will integrate with the wine. It may go through longer than that. Some of the finer ones will be kept in cellars and then only released at a later date when the chef de cave or the winemaker believes it's ready for market. So some are aged for longer. Now, a lot of people are often quite disappointed with sparkling wines because you don't actually know, if you don't know the provenance of it and where it's come from, you don't know exactly how old it is. It may have been left aside somewhere and not stored correctly, and it therefore may be actually quite an old wine within. You might actually lose its bubbles as well. But there has been a big movement, certainly in the Champagne region, to actually start listing disgorgement dates on the label. You can see here there's a Bruno Bayard bottle, an Extra Brut, which at the bottom says they're disgorged on January 2017. So say if this was then consumed this year in 2020, you know that it hasn't actually had a huge amount of time sitting in bottle. It's about 3-ish years or so. So it is important that disgorgement dates become more common, because it gives us an indication of how old that product is in the bottle. I always tell a story at the school when I teach this, that my mother and father, when they were cleaning out the garage, they weren't big drinkers when I was younger. And they cleared out the garage, and they found a bottle of Moet and Chandon, had a very old label design on it. And they're like, oh, you can have it. And I was like, it probably has been in your garage for about 20 years. Who knows where it was before then? But there's no indication on the label that tells you that's happened or how old it is, because it is a non-vintage. So that's quite confusing to many people. But there is a movement towards helping that today. So let's go through just a few things that may be asked of you around the traditional method. Now, this is more likely to be linked in with an actual region. So this is a bit more generic questions, but we'll go through into things like Champagne-led questions, Cava-led questions, and other world traditional method sparkling questions on later sections. But these are more generic, but they are still very important. You will need to know these and link them into the actual styles like Champagne and so on. So here's a question. State and explain 3 reasons why blending is important for the traditional method. So there are 3 reasons here. There actually could be another one, and I'll mention that a little bit later as well. So let's go with number 1. First of all, then, this is around creating a house style. So blending wines from different vineyards or different sites, grape varieties, and or vintages can help achieve a house style every year, despite vintage variation, which will often occur in cold climates. And throw in an example, like Champagne, for example, would be nice to throw in there. Always good to give examples. WSET examiners like examples, or what they often call flair. So that's 1 question answered. Number 2, this is all around achieving balance. So different grape varieties are often used to achieve more harmony and balance in a wine. Often using things like, for example, in Champagne, Chardonnay for citrus finesse and aging, Pinot Noir for red fruit roundness and body. You could say that's the same for Napa Valley traditional method sparkling wines. You could say that for many other examples in the New World as well, but Champagne, I think, is the most classic one, for instance. You could say it for Cava as well, but you guys are not required to actually go into too much detail about the grape varieties of Cava. And the third point is all about adding more complexity. And this is often done by blending in vin de réserve or reserve wine, which is wine that has been stored from previous years or vintages. Try and use better terminology like vintages that can contribute tertiary characters and flavors, such as dried fruits, to the fresher flavors of a younger wine. Okay, now you'll notice there's 9 marks are available for those 3 things. So therefore 3 marks are needed there. Really getting the stating a general thing like adding complexity, achieving balance, or creating a house style, and then describing it in a couple of sentences will get you the marks there. You could also talk about the Liqueur d'expédition, or the Dosage, the wine that is used for that. Can often create a bit more complexity as well. So you could add that into this point if you want to, but you have written enough there to get the marks for that bit. Okay, and the next question, account for flavors and aromas of bread, dough, and biscuit in a traditional method sparkling wine. So basically, when it says something like account for this, It really means you need to describe the process which will obtain these flavors and aromas in the wine. So let's go through that. There's quite a bit written here, but let's read through it. So after the second fermentation is complete, the active yeast will die and forms a sediment of lees in the bottle. All this terminology is very important to help you get those extra marks. So things like sediment of lees here, very important. Over a period of months and perhaps years, these dead yeast cells start to break down as they're dead, and they release chemical compounds into the wine in a process called yeast autolysis. Please make sure that that is a central part of the answer of this question, yeast autolysis. You must get used to writing that. This process will usually last 4 to 5 years. It can be a little bit less and can be greater, balancing the acidity, of course, contributing more body, and adding aromas and flavors, which the question is aiming towards, like bread, dough, and biscuit. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, that really brings to a close this part 2 on understanding sparkling wines for the Level 3 certificate. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any concerns, comments, or questions, please pop them in the comments section below this video on YouTube, or please get in touch with us via the Wine with Jimmy website or the social media, which is all listed at the bottom of each slide. There's also the wine schools there at the bottom and the wine bar. If you really want to come and experience great wine education in person, please come and visit West London Wine School or South London Wine School. And if you really want to see a great wine list in London, my wine bar, Streatham Winehouse, is a really good fun place. So next time you're in London, come and see us for a class, a glass, or a bottle. My name's been Jimmy Smith. Thank you so much.